Welcome to Module 4, the last but probably most important module of this digital transformation course that BCG and Darden School of Business have jointly developed. In the first module, you have learned about 3 fundamental exponential trends and how those have driven the evolution of technology and therefore have influenced our world. In Module 2, Mike has discussed the underlying economics of a digital transformation. And in the third module, we have introduced a set of digital trends that have a strong impact on businesses today and in the future. As already announced earlier, in this, the fourth module, we'll talk about the how. How companies can tackle the challenges of a digital transformation. We'll start by sharing a comprehensive framework to see all the building blocks businesses should tackle in such a high-stakes program. Then Aman, Sonia, and I will walk you through each building blocks of the framework. These videos are enriched by a set of different expert interviews and application examples. Here's the framework first. It starts with something that should define a company's overall approach, not just towards digital, but to where and how it should operate to maximize value creation. It's strategy. We will discuss how business strategy as a discipline was deeply transformed by, among other things, the recent technology evolution. We will then outline a practical approach for companies to define their strategies depending on the business environment they're operating in. The second layer of our framework has a fundamental duality that companies need to manage under the broader umbrella of a digital transformation. Digitizing the core on one side, creating new digital growth on the other. We'll give you a comprehensive guide to how digitization effort should be carried out, not as process automation, but a more end-to-end customer experience design. After looking at the company's core, we will take a look further out to what defines a company's future value creation. Its growth. How can a company find those new adjacencies? And how should it manage the resource allocation tension with the core business? Lastly, we'll look at the enablers, and there are 4 of them. First, people and organization. This is not only about structure. It's about culture, governance, and adopting the way of working. What should it be in the digital age? And how can it be scaled to a full company? Another prerequisite that we have touched upon in the previous module is data and analytics. Despite big data and advanced analytics being commonly used terms in business, they still trigger misconception in many managers' mind. We will go through the most common ones and help you see how it works with the practical examples from the transportation industry. The third enabler is technology, the backbone of the transformation. We will of course talk about how the tech function can be digital ready, but we will also address the common tension, the legacy system that any incumbent business will face at some point. Are you already beginning to wonder how can a company manage all those building blocks by itself? Well, it doesn't need to. That's why there's a 4th enabler, the ecosystem. So the question becomes, who in the company's ecosystem can help? And how to build the right partnership framework. Sounds exciting? Let's get started. In the fourth module, we'll focus on BCG's framework for digital transformation program. To do that, we have the pleasure of having Tom Reichert here with us. Tom is our senior partner from the New York office. He is our global practice area chair, and he also heads up our global digital and analytics agenda. In his role, Tom, together with his team, have created the digital transformation framework, where it consists of a few key building blocks for company to be successful in digital transformation. Tom, very happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Ching Fong.
Maybe to start off our conversation, can you please describe the key building blocks in our digital transformation framework?
The framework has 4 major components. The first component asks how digital is changing the business strategy of companies. It looks at major trends in digital and analytics technologies and how these trends allow companies to fundamentally change the strategic direction and the business model that is supporting this direction. The second component looks at how companies digitize the core. All steps of the value chain, from the customer interface through the supply chain and to the shared functions. The third component looks at opportunities companies have for new growth. It asks where companies have assets that could be taken out of the company and commercialized broader across the industries. And the fourth component looks at all the components that companies have to put in place to be successful in digital transformations. All the way from recruiting, training, ways of working, to underlying technology, data and analytics capabilities, and how companies will engage in a more open architecture world with other participants in the industry.
Well, it sounds like a very comprehensive framework. So maybe let us take it through layer by layer. Starting with the strategic layer, how do you think the company needs to think about strategy in this digital world versus previously?
We believe that companies have to think in an integrated way. There is a business strategy, but there's not really a digital strategy for most companies in the future anymore. It will all become one. So therefore, we are most interested in identifying the key trends on the digital side. And what I mean by that is, how can information, for example, change the way companies interact with their customers? How can automation change the way supply chains operate? How can more digital products be created? And then to translate how these trends enable a more comprehensive evolution of the strategy of the company, which then will have to translate into the overall operating model.
Okay. So once they have figured out the strategy, it's time now to make something happen. And you have highlighted there are 2 paths they can do. One is digitizing the core. The other one is seeking new growth opportunity. How does one company balance between the 2?
We find that companies very often have opportunities in both components. They certainly have many opportunities in digitizing the core, and they usually have very interesting assets that allow plays on new digital growth. At the end of the day, the choice between these 2 components depends on 2 questions. The first one is, what value creation can be achieved in each component? And the second question is, how many operational, organizational, people capabilities do you have in place to pursue a broader portfolio of initiatives?
I see. Then when it comes to actually doing it successfully, I would imagine the company need the enablers that you talk about, right? Ranging from people and organization, the ways of working, data analysis, and ecosystem. it sounds like a lot of items for a company to juggle, right? What are the typical challenges companies will face in creating all these enablers? And what are some of the ways that they can do to overcome such challenges?
It is a comprehensive perspective, as you say, Ching Fong, but that is what is needed to fundamentally transform companies in the digital age. In terms of importance, they all have their place. We find that many companies are thinking a lot about the people challenges in that time. We know that we are recruiting for different talent. You will need some more technical skills. You will need some skills of people who work in a more agile way. We know we need people, for example, in marketing departments that understand digital marketing versus traditional marketing. So the components around the people agenda, how the workforce changes, how the ways of work is changing, is a very critical part of the agenda. Equally, many companies will have to transform their underlying technology environment, and that relates to the middle two boxes. Firstly, in order to be able to allow for more real-time interactions between customer interaction points and very often product systems. And secondly, new data architectures have to be built. Data lakes, real-time progressing of information across the technology environment has to be done. And then the block that you see in the ecosystems is becoming a more and more important space. We do not believe that companies, no matter how capable they have been in the past, have all the assets to play in the new world. It is often a faster, more effective, more creative way to interact with other players in the ecosystem and to bundle, partner, or even acquire different assets to create the business model for the future.
Okay. So now let's bring this comprehensive framework to life. From your experience, how does one company apply this framework to start their journey on digital transformation? How long does it take? What are typically the first few steps they have to do to undertake the digital transformation?
We find that companies come at this in different ways. But let me highlight 3 paths that I think are very promising. Some companies work their way throughout the framework in the way we've just walked through it. They start with a strategic look at the future of their business model. They very often do that either in executive committee strategy sessions, in board sessions, or in more open environment with other partners, be that academic environments or consultants or investment bankers. And then out of that agenda, they create a portfolio of opportunities, work their way through the execution, and deal with the enabling questions in the lower part of the framework to support the execution of that program. Another path that we have seen is that companies start with a very customer-centric view. They say the customer is really at the heart of our value delivery framework, and we want to create experiences from customers backwards throughout the organization that are seamless and very powerful. This is the approach that is very often called a customer journey-led approach. Companies create anywhere between 20 and 40 customer journeys, start with the customer experience and work all the way through everything that is required to adapt those customer journeys in the digital age. Be that on a sale of a product, be that on a servicing interaction, you name it. The third path that we see is a more bottom-up approach. Companies gain advantage, have very good initiatives in individual parts of their business. And as they learn, they expand those initiatives further. For example, they start working in an agile way in one business unit. And as that matures, they're rolling their agile activities across the organization. They do digital marketing in one part of the organization, and then, very similarly, take it further across the full company.
Well, great, Tom. It seems like there are many paths towards this whole digital transformation framework, but what is clear is for companies to be successfully transform themselves to be digital, they need to touch on almost all of the elements of the framework.
That is correct, Ching Fong. All companies will have to at least look at all components of the framework and answer themselves what will be required for a winning position to sustain and evolve our competitive advantage, and therefore what is our journey and our trajectory throughout the changes that digital provides.
Great, Tom. Thank you very much for the insightful sharing and also for the very comprehensive digital transformation framework. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Ching Fong.
Technology has definitely changed business strategy. We have seen in Module 1 how digital technology has completely deconstructed the business architecture of many industries. Mike has also described in Module 2 how it has enabled newcomers to disrupt established market leaders. And you can certainly infer from the previous module, Module 3, that this trend is likely to continue for a while. As a consequence, many businesses find it harder and harder to build their strategy in such new environments. The traditional sources of competitive advantage are becoming fragile. For example, what we call positional advantage, the advantage that you have by being the share leader of your market, is not sustainable anymore. Today, only 7% of companies that are market share leaders are also profit share leaders, down from 25% in the 1960s. This raises a legitimate question about what does it mean to do strategy in the digital age. Some business leaders have at some point even suggested that strategy is dead. Let me be clear first. Strategy is not dead. It was not dead when Netflix made the decision to reallocate resources to a nascent distribution channel in the early 2000s. And it is definitely not dead today when taxi companies are attempting to shift their business model under the pressure of Uber, Lyft, or Grab. What is dead, however, is the one-size-fits-all approach to strategy, if that was ever useful. So, what is the right approach to strategy in a world of digital disruption? My colleague Martin Reeves and his team have done extensive research to characterize different approaches to strategy in their book, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. Let's start by looking at the classical approach first, the one many of us have learned in business school. This is where the strategist would start by analyzing his business environment, his starting and target position, the gap between the two. Then he would plan how to bridge that gap with a sequence of programs, initiatives, actions. Next, he would go into execution mode, reallocating resources and controlling the outcomes versus competition. In reality, this approach works in business environments that are satisfying two conditions. They are highly predictable and non-malleable. Predictability means that by having enough understanding of the different market variables, you can know with certainty how the market will evolve in the future. This is why planning makes sense. The lack of malleability, on the other hand, means that you can only influence your own business trajectory, not other players, definitely not your competitors against whom you are racing. Although markets satisfying those two conditions are becoming rare, they do exist. The candy industry is an example. For decades, players like Mars have emphasized planning and efficiency in a very stable and predictable environment. Unfortunately, I see many business or government leaders still thinking their strategy through the classical lens, independently from the environment. Why is that? Partly because sometimes leaders fail to fully grasp the level of uncertainty in their industries. This is especially true when technology-led disruptions are in play. You remember from Module 1 how we tend to always underestimate the exponential progress and think of it as linear and slow. This is the same phenomenon. The reality today is that fewer environments remain purely classical. So we need to expand what Martin and his colleagues call our strategy palette. The strategy palette describes the other approaches to strategy beyond classical in environments that are unpredictable or malleable or both. Let's take a market where unpredictability becomes high, but still with a low level of malleability. Here, long-term planning doesn't work anymore, and strategists need to have a more adaptive approach, an approach with constant goal refinement, much shorter iteration cycles based on experimentation. Basically, a trial and error approach. When a new idea, new product, new business model doesn't work, stop it quickly. When it does, scale it up and then go to the next idea. Telenor, a Norwegian telco, as an example, funds innovations through a similar logic before integrating them back to the broader business. The company closely manages its experimentation engine with measures such as cost for experimentation, time to market, percentage of sales coming from new products, etc. This is how you should act when technological evolutions are not predictable. You experiment with different variations, select the useful one, scale it up, and repeat. On the opposite side, in environments that are predictable and malleable, a different approach is needed. These are often markets at early stages of their maturity, where existing value proposition is weak, where you have very little competition and limited regulation. In this malleable environment, a single firm can change the status quo by bringing a bold vision at the right moment, and as a result, create the future with some degree of predictability. This is what we call a visionary strategy. A visionary strategy takes effort, resources, and a lot of persistence. Effort first to see what others have missed, an unmet customer need that nobody has addressed, or the opportunity to disrupt an existing process with new technology. Then it takes resources to build those products or services. As the vision is, by definition, starting in the early stages of the adoption cycle, you will need to fund the business for some time before it reaches the economically viable stage. Lastly, it needs persistence, waiting for the inflection point. UPS, the package delivery company, for example, anticipated already in 1994 a change in their industry towards e-commerce parcel delivery, and spotted the opportunity of becoming the enabler for global e-commerce. They needed to be persistent, and for quite some time, they invested $1 billion per year in the required IT system until their persistence finally paid off. In 2000, UPS had 60% market share of the total US e-commerce shipping market. We are left with a fourth type of environment, both unpredictable and malleable. With the evolution of digital technology, we will probably see more of those. Think blockchain for money transfer, for example, or artificial intelligence for managing customer interactions. The difference with the visionary environment is that a single player won't be able to control all the environment and steer it predictably. This is where companies need a shaping strategy. A strategy where they work with a whole ecosystem of suppliers, customers, competitors, policymakers to gradually build the end vision. This is what Apple did with its iPhone ecosystem, or Google with its Android equivalent. We have also described in Module 3 the challenges facing blockchain or AI startups. Those are typically challenges that they should tackle by engaging their ecosystem, orchestrating it to sustain their competitive advantage. and evolve in their role depending on how the ecosystem as a whole reacts. Let me give you a non-digital example of how this could look like. Novo Nordisk, a pharmaceutical company, entered China in the early 1990s, when diabetes awareness and prevalence were low. However, with more than 80 million Chinese expected to suffer from the chronic disease by 2025, Novo saw an unexploited opportunity to shape the industry. Novo's shaping strategy began with establishing partnerships with the Chinese Ministry of Health and the World Diabetes Foundation, and investing heavily in physicians' education about the diabetes threat and potential treatments. By 2010, there was a strong community of physicians and patients who saw Novo's commitment over the years. Novo ended up with about 60% of the diabetes healthcare market in China.
Không.
In addition to those 4 approaches to strategy, there is a 5th and last one, the renewal strategy. It is needed in harsh environments when a company suffers from severe underperformance in growth, margin, or free cash flow, in a way that even threatens its survival. This is typically what incumbents will go through in a digital disruption like what Mike has described in Module 2. This is Nokia versus Apple a few years ago, or the taxi companies versus Uber in many cities today. Here, a renewal strategy requires the company to proceed in 2 steps. Conserve resources to ensure its survival, and then choose a new approach to rejuvenate growth. This can sometimes mean abandoning the core business and going to somewhere less crowded. So, one approach does not fit all. A company needs to carefully monitor its business environment and choose the right approach to craft its strategy. To be accurate, it needs to choose the right combination of approaches. Because any given company is likely to operate in different environments with different business lines, geographies, products. For example, if I am using the stack terminology from Module 1, a company can run a legacy infrastructure business in the classical environment, together with an asset-light platform business in the shaping or visionary environment. This is also dramatically changing over time. A legacy infrastructure business can be shaken by a substitution technology, like what banks face with blockchain today. This can create uncertainty on customer response, on transaction risk, on regulation. So instead of a classical strategy, you need to switch to an adaptive, maybe even a shaping strategy. The role of a business leader is to recognize which combination of environments he is operating in and orchestrate different approaches simultaneously. We refer to this ability as strategic ambidexterity. This is, of course, not an easy thing to achieve, especially in large-scale organizations. But we will discuss later in one of the videos how this links to exploration versus exploitation dilemma that Mike has introduced in Module 2. But let me first summarize the most important takeaways from this video. The classical linear approach to strategy, although still relevant in some cases, is not sufficient anymore to guarantee a sustainable competitive advantage. Businesses need to adopt new approaches depending on the level of uncertainty or malleability of their environments, adaptive, visionary, shaping, or renewal strategies. Business leaders need to permanently choose the combination of approaches their businesses need and run them simultaneously.
Few months ago, I flew to attend a client meeting in New Delhi. I must say, it was an interesting experience. When I purchased my ticket online, it took me quite a while to enter all the required information. My contact details, my passport information, my credit card details, all re-entered for multiple times. I finally got my ticket, but I couldn't believe that I actually have to print it out and take the hard copy with me. At the airport, I saw at the departure board that my plane was delayed. So I tried to find out if I will still reach my connection. Nobody knew. So I ended up standing in line at one of the counters to ask. The assistant told me that there will not be a problem to reach the connection since the other plane is also delayed. Finally, I took my flight. After landing, I asked the flight assistant how I can reach my connecting flight, only to learn that my other plane has already left the airport without me. I ended up missing my connecting flight and the important meeting I was supposed to go to. I don't know about you, but I get unhappy if a product or a service isn't working the way I expect it to work. I sense that my level of tolerance to bumpy customer experience has decreased. Why is this? Because we are accustomed to seamless interaction with digital innovation, the Amazon, Netflix, Ubers of the world. We expect everything to work smoothly, integrated, and intuitively as switching to a new iPhone. What does that mean for companies? When I talk to some of my clients about what they do in terms of digitization, I sometimes get answers like, we're making all processes paperless, or we have a whole department for digitization. The first thing I ask them is, why? Digitization needs to fulfill a business purpose, not because it's fashionable. This purpose can be efficiency, getting to the operational excellence. The current economic environment in many parts of the world puts more and more pressures on companies to become leaner. And digitization can help with that. However, I would argue that this must go hand in hand with enhancing customer experience. In fact, a study from the MIT Sloan School of Management found that companies that increases both digital operational excellence and customer experience outperform industry average net margin by up to 16 percentage points. The study also shows that enhancing customer experience alone doesn't get you to the industry average profitability. But focusing on operational excellence doesn't make you an industry overperformer neither. It is doing the two together. However, only 25% of companies manage to excel in both dimensions. It is hard, but rewarding. This is why it's critical to have an end-to-end approach to digitization, one that isn't limited to automating existing processes, but completely rethinking how value is delivered to the end user. To help you see the difference clearly, let me give you an example from the last century. In the early days of car adoption, drivers used to use their hands to indicate that they're about to turn left or turn right. This was the ancestor of the turn light. But before getting where we are now, the first step was a pure automation of the human gesture. Cars have mechanical arms in the back, one on the left and one on the right. And they move to indicate where the drivers intend to go. So, when a business wants to digitize its subscription process, for example, the elegant solution is not to put that form on an iPad to go paperless. It should rethink the whole process from the lens of what today's customer expect. To achieve this, I invite my clients to shift their mindset from thinking about a process to thinking about a customer journey. What is customer journey? It is the step-by-step experience a customer goes through to use a service or product. It can go from the first inquiry to the after-sales service. And it is not just about one journey. Every business would typically manage dozens of different customer journeys through different channels for different products and services. For a bank, for example, there's one customer journey for opening a deposit account, one for applying a loan, and another one for transferring money. And there is a different set of journeys if you do all those as a business owner versus individual consumer. Throughout the journey, the customer is at the center of the universe. And whatever change or automation, you want to make sure the processes should be triggered and assessed from the lens of that consumer. Let's go back to my flight and see what I would have loved it to look like. When I searched for the tickets online, I could already select different options. Not only which flight and connection I want to take, but also meals, carry-on luggage options. My payment details were already pre-filled from my last purchase instead of filling them every time again. And with just one click, I bought the ticket and downloaded it to my iPhone wallet instead of printing it out. Also, my Outlook calendar was updated automatically with the flight details. On that day, I received a push message that there is a lot of traffic on the way to the airport and that I therefore should leave 20 minutes earlier. The app also informed me about gate changes, delay, chances to reach my connecting flight, and alternative connection if I don't. Even though my initial flight was still delayed, I was able to reach Delhi on time through an alternative connection. And I would have my successful meeting. So how do companies develop great digital end-to-end customer journey as just described? Design thinking provides a compelling framework to reimagine customer journey with the customer at the center of attention. Let me explain what this means. In essence, the design thinking process is iterative, is flexible, and focus on collaboration between designer and user. It consists of 5 steps. The first stage aims to give the designer team an empathetic understanding of the problem they are trying to solve. What is the customer looking for? What are the so-called moments of truth? What really bothers him or her? Is it a complicated online purchase process for the airline ticket? So how do companies develop great digital end-to-end customer journey as just described? Design thinking provides a compelling framework to reimagine customer journey with the customer at the center of attention. Let me explain what this means. In essence, the design thinking process is iterative, is flexible, and focus on collaboration between designer and user. It consists of 5 steps. The first stage aims to give the designer team an empathetic understanding of the problem they are trying to solve. What is the customer looking for? What are the so-called moments of truth? What really bothers him or her? Is it a complicated online purchase process for the airline ticket? Or is it the missing information on the flight delay? Or both? In the next stage, the team analyzes its observation from the first stage and synthesizes them. They might need to reframe the problem in human-centric way or even define a new unmet needs that should be tackled. In this example of my flight, it is the lack of transparency on gate changes, on delay, and on alternative connection. In the third stage, the ideating stage, the team members start to identify new solutions to the problem. How could you create transparency? By providing push messages on the smartphone? How could the airline go further? Anticipate customer questions? In the fourth, the prototyping stage, the team produces a number of inexpensive, scaled-down versions of the product or services feature they want to change. It is an experimental phase, and the aim is to allow rapid improvement on the initial solution. The app I use to buy my tickets and get notification might have just been a draft version, a minimum viable product. It doesn't need to look fancy, but it incorporated the key features that are important to the customer. In the fifth stage, the testing phase, the team tests the prototype in real-life conditions to see how it impacts the customer experience along the whole journey. That is basically a trial and error process. The successful features will be rolled out at scale. The failed ones should direct the team back to the drawing board, talk to the customer again, rethink new solution, prototype them, testing them, and so on. This five-step approach is carried out in a very flexible, non-linear fashion, meaning you can always jump back to an earlier step, or different groups within the design team may work at different stages depending on their respective features. I want to stress that this approach is equally relevant for products and service innovation, for back-end operations, for go-to-market, and even rethinking support function. The difference is that if we are talking about HR, for example, the end-to-end digital journey is the internal employee's experience during recruiting, onboarding, skills development, etc. If you want to hear more about the different types, have a look at our conversation with Antoine, our senior partner from our Paris office, who will walk us through some real-life example. Few things to keep in mind from this video. When companies embark on a digitization agenda, they need to aim for both higher operational efficiency and better customer experience. This is how companies maximize the value they can generate versus industry peers. The right lens to rethink value delivery is to shift from focusing on process automation to what they mean for key moments in the end-to-end customer journey. To redesign a customer journey, digitization teams can follow a 5-step iterative process centered on the customer needs and feedback.
We're still exploring the early steps of how a company can embark into a digital transformation journey. And to discuss this in more details, we are fortunate to have with us today Antoine Gourevitch. Antoine is a senior partner in BCG Paris office. He has run multiple digitization projects, and he's actually now our global practice area leader for data and digital platforms. Antoine, welcome.
Thank you for having me there.
So Antoine, in the course, we have described how managers should rethink their customer journeys, how they should run that new redesign process. But when we step back and we think of incumbent companies who have a legacy business to run, who need to continue running that while thinking of how they digitize different journeys and different core processes, how should they organize? Where should they start?
I think that's a very good question. And as we know, it's much easier to create a startup than to run a company that has a huge legacy. I guess the customer journey and starting with the client is probably a very good start. And there, you should start with, how do I increase my loyalty? How do I increase my conquest? And choose really a few, not pilots, because I guess for me, the main, I would say, trap would be to go into pilots. And in every company today, you have dozens of pilots, but bringing absolutely no money. What is very important is to choose a few areas where you're going to go at scale and really get money and value. So for example, if you decide to go and increase your share of wallet, for example, in after sales, by mixing data from different sources, then you should deploy that in all countries at once to really go to tens of millions of value. And I would say companies should begin to go to think big, choose specific areas of value, and definitely avoid what I call the pilots or proof of concept trap.
And when you talk about scale, what makes it difficult to get to scale? Because you're right, actually a lot of companies just go into the infinite pilot phase. What is difficult in getting things to scale?
So what is difficult for scale is the fact that when you do a pilot, you are taking data and cleaning the data, for example, from different sources, I would say in a very artisanal way. And it's extremely difficult to replicate to everywhere else. For example, we did a pilot for one of the automakers in Belgium, and we took the data from the finance department, the after-sales departments, from the sales companies. We put them together, and so we were able to increase market share by 4 points. Now, the question was, how do you do the same in Brazil, in Russia, in China, in US? And if you have not thought before about, where is the data, what industrial platform are you going to build to put the data in place, you need to replicate country by country, which is an extremely costly process. So you need to do both things, innovation to prove that it can work, and think beforehand into how will you industrialize that. And today, it's easy to do it, for example, in the data space with the cloud, with cloud-based platform. but it's not a magic solution, so you need to go into the legacy systems. But I would say, for me, the difference between companies that successfully digitize and the other are the people who are both breaking the compromise between innovation and industrialization. And it all starts with a data platform. I mean, the companies like Uber, Amazon, Google, Facebook, they have natively built a digital platform, so it's kind of easy, and they can organize the world around data. For example, Amazon is updating its price 25,000 times a day. And you can do that only if you have a very clean and very, I would say, efficient data platform. If you go into banking or into energy or into automotive, nobody has a data platform that can do that. So you have to build the data platform, which is a bit contradictory to what people think, is that digitization is about changing the front office and building, mobile apps, which is very easy, and true, that takes a few weeks. But you still have to work on the legacy. Now, the other trap is, if you listen to some IT people who are a bit old style, they will tell you, okay, let's do a transformation of the legacy for 3 years, which is also not the answer. So between 3 weeks and 3 years, you have to find the good middle ground where we say, okay, how do we decouple the mobile application to be extremely simple and provocative, the data and the legacy to make them all work. And this is, for me, how you can really industrialize and change. And what is fascinating in this is that when you speak to a CEO today, he will speak with you about technology and data. I mean, that's something that would never have happened before. I was working in a bank, and actually we were doing a project for them, and then we had a CEO meeting where the CEO said, tell me what options I will not be able to exert if my architecture is going this direction. So that's a new type of question. Another discussion that you can have with CEO today is when they go to China and meet, for example, with Jack Ma of Alibaba, the guy said, I've put all my IT into the cloud, by the way, it's the Alibaba cloud, and then I'm not speaking to any IT people anymore. I'm just concentrating on, sales people. So the CEO who came back to US or to Europe are, asking us the question, should I put all my IT into the cloud and do the same thing? Which, of course, is a good idea, but it's a bit more complex to put in place. But anyway, I would say the key is to really have in mind the fact that you will need to be much more fast in the way you are delivering your applications to both internet, mobile, and everything, so the multi-channels. And the way to deliver it for clients is, like every month or every 2 or 3 months, but also do that on a solid foundation. And companies who will win, and I believe, by the way, that companies will win over startups. I think that companies who are able to digitize will be much better than startups because they have the data, they have the assets, they have the capabilities, will really break the compromise and win the game.
And one core idea in here is, how do you manage to run at 2 different speeds? I like a lot your idea of 2-speed IT that you have introduced, actually in one MOOC that you guys should check out at some point. How do you manage that? How do you manage the 2 speeds if you have a big legacy that you need to run while creating the new platform?
Yeah, so 2-speed IT is of course needed, but should not last for too long. Because of course in the beginning you have I would say your legacy, which is evolving at a certain speed, and we know the speed of the legacy is very difficult. One of my favorite CEO said, whenever in the banking industry, said whenever I open the hood to change my legacy system, it costs me 1 million, and it just takes 3 months to understand the impact before I can do any coding. So with this type of legacy, you have a speed which is more in a year time frame. Of course, when you are building a digital, data platform to be able, for example, to increase market share by understanding better, the customer moment of truth. For example, if you want to understand if the customer likes the product or where they buy the product, and so you want to adjust that, you should be in the weeks or months. Okay. So you have 2 speeds, and so you need to adjust. But the key is to decouple the legacy to the front office so that at least you can go at the same speed. And then, suddenly you can start to do things. So the way to do it is to take out the data that is in the legacy, put it into a data platform, which is going to be an industrial data platform, could be in the cloud, could be not in the cloud. And then I would say the modern application will tap into the data and will make the legacy work only on the traditional functions. So by doing that, you can have an evolution of over, let's say, 5-10 years to simplify the legacy, but you will be building your digital platform based on a data platform which enables you to break the compromise. So I would say modern companies, very old companies, use this modern approach, which is working extremely well. It's not rocket science, but the key to that is to have the capabilities to be able to do it. So you need to have software engineers, you need to have architects who understand deeply the new technology and deeply the old legacy architecture. And so we're able to do that. It's extremely difficult today when you have lost the architecture, I would say, capabilities, which happen in some places, especially in industrial goods, in energy, a bit less so in banking, because in banking you have less software package.
All right, that's a fascinating talk, Antoine. Thank you very much for taking that time to share with us all that knowledge.
Thank you very much.
How does a company create value? I want us to take a minute and think about this fundamental business question. Let's imagine that you have some money on the side and you would like to invest it. You think hard and you come up with a product idea that you believe will serve an unmet need in your city. You convince a friend to lend you some more funds and you create your own company to build and sell this ingenious product. Let's assume that at the start, your business is worth $1 million. By this I mean, if you want to sell your company, an investor would be happy to pay that amount of money to own it. Fast forward 5 years. Your business has grown to be worth $10 million. Here's my question. Where do you think this additional value is coming from? Well, there is a variety of sources. Maybe your business has some real estate that appreciated over time. Maybe it quickly became profitable at some point in time and that profit was kept in the company. Maybe you grew from your city to covering the country to maybe a global player. If you are like the largest 125 S&P 500 companies in 2004, those growth prospects would be fueling 78% of your market capitalization. However, this source of growth has an inherent limitation. You will reach a plateau in the adoption curve that Mike has described in Module 2. Once you have gone from the city to the country to the globe, where else do you want to go? This is the point where you will need to look for new sources of growth. And in fact, this has become harder and harder over time. If you look at the period between 2004 and 2014, growth options contribution to market capitalization has dropped to 68%, 10 percentage points lower than 2004. One of the reasons is that technology has deconstructed established industries and lowered significantly the barriers for entry, especially for new digital attackers. New startups, in fact, became very good at capturing value from market leaders, especially those that felt a bit too comfortable in their stable, slow-growing plateau. So, if we go back to your business, as a business leader, instead of trying to cope with disruption when it happens, you might want to anticipate it by proactively looking for self-disruption. That is, finding new digital growth, sometimes at the expense of your legacy business. This is actually not trivial when we talk about incumbent, established industry players. They should be efficient at managing the legacy business, which is still the predominant source of value, and at the same time build new ventures that might make the legacy business obsolete. In other terms, run exploitation of their core and exploration of adjacencies at the same time. This ability is an example of what we have called ambidexterity. and large organizations are not good at it. In fact, only 11% of firms manage to achieve ambidexterity. What typically happens is, once a company pursues innovation, it loses efficiency. Once it is exploring, it neglects exploitation. Like 3M, for example. In the early 2000s, they have deployed Six Sigma teams throughout the organization to increase operational excellence. Surely enough, operating profits as a percentage of sales went up. But they neglected innovation during that time. The new product vitality index, that is the percentage of sales from products that are less than 5 years in the market, went down. In 2005, Sir George W. Buckley was appointed CEO, and he shifted gears towards innovation. The new product vitality index went up, but operating income went down. If you want to intuitively feel why it is hard to do both, let's do an experiment. I want you to start by crossing your arms. Feel comfortable? Now, I want you to shift your lower arm to the top. How does that feel? Awkward, right? Organizations also are like that. When they find a way of doing something, they are uncomfortable changing it. So they fall into one of two common traps: the success trap or the perpetual search trap. Nokia has been victim to the former. They underestimated the migration to touch screens and continued a bit too long with the feature phone. BCG research shows that over a 10-year period, explorers grew 6 percentage points faster than exploiters and delivered 2.4 percentage points higher total shareholder returns. The other extreme, pure exploration, or what we have called the perpetual search trap, is not risk-free neither. Xerox is a good example here. They invested heavily in innovation, especially at the end of the last century. Engineers in Xerox PARC were the first ones to create an early prototype of the modern PC with a graphical user interface, a mouse, even before Apple's Macintosh in 1984. They have invented laser printers, invented Ethernet, but they have failed to monetize them. So, how can a company avoid those traps? How can a large, complex organization achieve strategic ambidexterity? Let me walk you through 3 very practical ways to balance exploration and exploitation. The first intuitive answer is to encourage switching. By that I mean to proactively take a team from exploitation stage to exploration stage. Typically, a manager would do that at the end of a product adoption cycle and the early stages of a substitution technology. Coring is a great example here. Since 1960, they have been experimenting with chemically strengthened glass, which was used, for example, in cars or in the aviation industry. But the lack of demand led to a series of failures that, in turn, led to the company hitting their lowest share price in 2002. They then revived experimentation to see if their glass know-how could be leveraged in consumer electronics. And once approached by Apple, Corning rapidly focused on its so-called Gorilla Glass product, now found in more than 5 billion mobile devices worldwide. Switching is very hard in practice because it relies on getting the timing right in a very narrow window of opportunity. A different way is to create separate units to serve separate objectives. This usually leads to the formation of a small team of explorers on the fringes of the organization with atypical profiles, more digital natives, people whose background is different from the legacy business. Their mandate is not to deliver immediate revenue target, but to help think about alternative sources of growth in the long run. In one of my clients, we call them growth hackers. Last but not least, a company can rely on its ecosystem. Sourcing ideas externally is a pragmatic approach for businesses that are unable to manage ambidexterity with internal resources. In practice, this can be executed in a variety of forms: acquisitions, partnerships, incubation, or other more informal exchanges of ideas. Google's acquisition of DeepMind or BNP Paribas Open Innovation FinTech Incubator are great examples of this approach. In all those 3 variations, orchestrations is what defines success from failure. I will take an example to illustrate what I mean. Let's go back to your $10 million company that we have built in the beginning of this video. You now know that you need to channel your resources in 2 different ways. A portion will go to exploitation and another will go to exploration. You can, for example, choose to do so through a model of separation, where the new growth hacking team will get X% of the budget and the rest is used to run the cash cow. So my question is this: what is X? Defining X is a key strategic decision, and as such, the way you should think about it will depend on your business environment, as we have described in the strategy approach video. For example, although a classical stable environment allows you to set your allocation for resources to, let's say, 10% for the medium long term, in an adaptive uncertain environment, which is most likely the case, you need a lot more iteration. What you will do in practice is build a feedback loop that constantly monitors the outcomes of your allocation and calibrate it up or down depending on how the environment evolves. If your growth hackers come up with a lot of disruption, a lot of ideas, great business potential, you might want to go from 10% to 12 or 15%, so that they can have bigger teams and develop prototypes faster. If the prototypes fail in market testing, then you might want to go back to 10% or even lower, 8, 7%. This is what I mean by orchestration: the continuous adjustment of resource allocation to guarantee the exploration-exploitation balance. So, let me summarize what you should keep in mind when looking for new digital growth. Disruption is a matter of when, not if. It will happen. And leading companies should strive to disrupt themselves before others do. The goal is to achieve ambidexterity, the balance between exploitation and exploration, avoiding both the success trap and the perpetual search trap. Whether a company builds ambidexterity through a separation, switching, or an ecosystem approach, it needs to continuously adjust it, allocating resources depending on the business environment and its evolution.
Innovation is the result of much more than just an aha moment. Let's take some time to talk about the innovation process and the approaches you might take to support innovators along the way. My name is David Tuvey, and I'm the director of the iLab here at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. We work with innovators every day of the week. Real and truly disruptive innovation requires hard work with uncertain outcomes along the way. And so the use of frameworks and guiding principles can help support innovators along this uncertain path. Furthermore, since any innovation will be used by someone or something in some way, the needs and wants and motivations of that end user, the someone or something that benefits from the product or service, become paramount to the impact of an opportunity for that innovation. When any new product idea hits the sorts of buttons that suggest a dramatic innovation, something we have not experienced before, our ability to gather reliable feedback on that impact and usefulness decreases significantly without being able to place the product in someone's hands or provide the service in person. Given these three challenges, we at the iLab, like many innovation labs, focus at the very least upon three core capabilities when supporting innovators and the challenges inherent to innovation. First, structuring the innovation process to combine the benefits of creativity, curiosity, ingenuity, science, and even chance. Second, understanding the end user, their challenges, needs, and wants, alongside the resulting impacts of any innovation. Third, engaging these end users and other potential stakeholders as directly as possible with some version of the product or service, however basic that version may be, to get tangible feedback along the way. Given the innovation process requires hard work with uncertain outcomes far beyond an aha moment, there is good reason to provide innovators with not only underlying frames and principles to structure the process, but also milestones to support that process. Design thinking is one of those frames. At its highest level, and as described by Tim Brown, the CEO of IDEO, design thinking is a human-centered approach drawing from the toolkit of designers to connect the complex dynamics of people, technology, and commerce, or simply life. This iterative and organic process, while perhaps the norm among experienced designers, can stand in stark contrast to the more linear institutional process adopted and even expected for corporate planning. In that corporate context, simply shifting people to this design-oriented frame can offer clear advantages. General principles, such as personas, jobs to be done, or effectuation, also help to structure the innovation challenge. The former two principles, personas and jobs to be done, focus upon the experiences of, underlying motivations for, and outcomes desired from a new product or service. As a result of this user-centered priority, any hopeful innovator is forced to take a few steps back from a unitary focus upon the technical details or business context of the product or service. Ultimately, the purpose of this exercise is to help people do what they need to do. The latter set of principles, those of effectuation, which we will not be able to describe in great detail here, play a helpful and dynamic role as any innovation begins to interact not only with end users, but also with other actors in the market context. Central to the effectual approach is the inclusion of a wider set of stakeholders in the development process, reducing the overall risk by way of this inclusion, while also creating a network of connections through which a product or service might be further refined and introduced to the market. Effectuation can be thought of as simply heading in a rather general direction with what you know, what you have, and who you know at the ready, then permitting this network of connections, knowledge, and resources to guide the process far more directly than your initial hunch or intent. It's cooking with what you have in the cupboards rather than deciding upon a meal and a recipe only to find out you don't have what you need. Alongside these frames and principles, the infusion of milestones along the way can help innovators convert what seems like a daunting, undoable challenge into a series of doable tasks, deliverable and measurable outputs, and even deniable tests. Why deniable tests? Because it's a myth that talented designers are gurus with the indwelled and infallible capacity to intuit what people really want. Ultimately, any new product or service idea is a hypothesis, a hunch, that assumes something about how the world works or what the world wants. Introducing milestones along the way forces hopeful innovators to identify and define their hypotheses and to test those hypotheses, leading to confirmation or denial of the initial assumptions. As a result of this hypothesis-driven approach to milestones, innovators can fail quickly, limiting committed resources to only those required to test the next assumption. Failure in this context is far more affordable and even convertible to new and better informed ideas. Perhaps the secret sauce to approaches such as design thinking are the ways in which these frames weave both understanding and engaging potential end users into an intertwined and iterative process. Human-centered approaches place extremely high value upon empathy rather than sympathy for the impacted users, a concern that can translate to a clearly defined, real problem with a root cause worth the commitment of time and uncertainty that will be required to develop a compelling solution. However, rather than convert this empathy to an immediate conclusion and a single solution, the next step in this process requires the ideation of multiple different solutions, followed by capturing general insights from potential users on all of these prospective solutions. Essentially, for any invention to truly address a real problem or opportunity, that invention needs to match the various dimensions of the experience need or opportunity as closely as possible. While guessing the right dimensions can be a successful tactic, guessing is also an approach that is likely to fail far more often than it succeeds. And so the development of a range of early guesses provides a convenient hack. Only one of a great many of these ideas needs to be headed in the right direction. We just don't know which one. We increase our chances of discovering this one by creating and getting feedback on a wide range of ideas. This feedback is then taken into account toward the development of an initial prototype, perhaps very low in fidelity. The purpose of this early prototype is to gather even more direct and realistic feedback from potential users. Low fidelity prototypes are simply those that can be built quickly and with a limited set of features and quality, perhaps even more limited than what seems like a minimal viable product. Focused as clearly as possible upon a single problem to be addressed. The emphasis of this part of the process being interactions with and inclusion of end users, not the production of the coolest prototype ever imagined or some endeavor to address all of the user's needs. This sequence of prototype and feedback then passes through a series of iterations, each stop along the way further refining the innovation in waiting before any final product decision is made. As a result, the challenge of understanding the end user is intertwined with the effort to engage that end user in the early and ongoing stages through which the product or service is being developed. Failure in this context is, ironically, an absolutely necessary part of the process. Each no, the supposed failure, sends an innovator in search of a yes, and each yes leads to a deeper refinement of the overall idea. Hopefully that was a helpful, albeit brief, introduction to the innovation process, how we might structure the process, understand the end user, and engage them. These are the approaches we take at the iLab to support innovators through the process.
How can my organization become digital ready? This is a question that I frequently hear from clients. But why is it so hard for them? Because becoming digital ready requires a massive change in how an organization thinks and how it functions. You have seen in the previous videos that executing a digitization agenda or exploring new digital disruption require a whole new set of capabilities. An ambidextrous leadership fast execution, experimental mindset, trial and error approach. These are qualities you see a lot in small companies, in startups with a strong entrepreneurial spirit. But as Mike has discussed in Module 2, this is also something that older or larger companies lose over time. Maybe with some exceptions. Zappos, the online retailer acquired by Amazon for more than $1 billion. Or you all know Spotify with their 1,600 employees. These are examples that we can learn from. But before we go there, let's look at traditional ways to organize for digital transformation. Well, there are many different models, but here are the 3 common archetypes. In the decentralized archetype, digital activities are integrated in each of the existing business units. Each BU has its own digital team. With this model, companies can develop BU-specific digital strategies and execute them more or less independently. In the centralized archetype, companies create a separate digital entity, maybe headed by a chief digital officer, to lead the transformation. This center of excellence defines the priorities, steers the allocation of resources, and executes the digital transformation programs in collaboration with the BUs. Then there's the excubator model, where the digital activities run in parallel, sometimes in competition with other business units. In this configuration, the CEO ensures the orchestration and potential arbitrages needed between the traditional business and the new ventures. In reality, companies often choose to run hybrid models, having both a central unit as well as a separate incubation lab, or both business unit teams and a center of excellence for support. Depending on the company's priorities and starting point, those structural solutions can help put the right emphasis on digital and support the transformation agenda. However, this doesn't fully change the legacy processes that are crippling many large organizations today. Beyond structural change, those organizations need to adopt a whole new way of working suited to the needs of the digital age. A way similar to how Zappos and Spotify have worked to maintain the competitive edge despite strong headwinds. This is what we call agile at scale. At the moment, agile is probably one of the most used words in business context. The part that everybody agrees on is a set of 4 principles that define the philosophy behind agile. You should check them out in our reading sections. Beyond that, there are different interpretations, tools, and methodologies that different thought leaders have developed to manage complex projects. Agile at scale for us at BCG refers to the ability to expand the agile philosophy from a team or project to a whole organization. But first of all, let me introduce 2 core concepts that agile at scale is trying to reconcile. Alignment on the one side, autonomy on the other. Traditional organizations ensure alignment through a hierarchical structure, a vertical line of command, probably a heritage from military strategy. But this doesn't allow much autonomy to the troops and makes movement slow. This is not what you need when you want to keep up with exponential growth. To allow for more autonomy, agile at scale relies on small execution units. Spotify, for example, calls them squads. Squads are fully autonomous, multidisciplinary teams, usually 10 to 15 people. They are fully responsible to deliver a certain product, for example, on building a new Spotify app feature. They are empowered to take the decisions required to ensure their delivery meets the end objective: make customers happy. But you don't want to have a collection of squads, each running in different directions. This destroys alignment, and it becomes anarchy. Many squads working on related topics can coordinate as part of the same tribe. And people with the same expertise, for example, the iOS app developers, can align on standards in so-called chapters. To ensure all those entities remain aligned over time, they need to be comfortable with another fundamental characteristics of the agile way of working: the iterative delivery of value. Here's an example from a totally different domain: painting. Imagine you want to create Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. In a traditional approach, often called the waterfall, you would go through a linear process of analysis, design, and execution. Means you would understand exactly how the painting is composed, gather a team by the colors, and then start painting, perhaps from the bottom, and then stepwise create the whole picture. If all goes well, then great. But what if not? If you realize that something went wrong midway, it's hard to reverse. In an iterative approach, on the other hand, you do things repeatedly in short iterations until you get them right. These short iterations are often referred to as sprints and enable you to change direction and react quickly as needed. In our Mona Lisa example, this means that you would start with a rough sketch, then add color, then perhaps contours, and finally higher resolution. In each of the steps, you have a minimum viable product, MVP. That is a draft that you can share at any early stage to collect and incorporate feedback. This is how you ensure alignment in an agile organization, by iteratively checking the broader environment and adjusting to the changes you see. What are the benefits of that? From working with clients that have implemented Agile at scale, I see multiple benefits. Let me just name a few. Through many iterations and constant feedback loops, the risk of taking the organization in the wrong direction decreases quickly. The focus on MVPs at every stage keeps high visibility on what value every team is creating. This allows for adjustments at any point in time. It also keeps the organization adaptive over time, in case an unforeseen disruptor or new opportunity arises. And last but not least, business impact can be realized much earlier, with early releases and faster time to market. In fact, our clients who have adopted an agile organization increase their time to market by 2 to 4 times, and workforce productivity by 20 to 30%. And there's more. In the long run, working in an agile environment improves employee engagement and helps to attract and retain superior digital talent. After all you've heard, implementing Agile at scale, that means transforming a whole organization, sounds like a huge challenge. And it certainly is. Incorporating the Agile mindset and ways of working does not only mean having the IT department running more feedback loops. It means changing all dimensions of a company's operating model in a multi-year journey. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go into details here. But let me quickly give you an overview of the key components you need to build for such a transformation. You need a business purpose that gets the balance between alignment and autonomy. You need to translate it to governance and funding principles. Then you need to build supporting mechanisms based on 3 pillars: a new structure, defining the squads, the tribes, the chapters; new processes, less linear, more iterative, more empowering; and new behaviors, how you hire employees, how you reward them, develop them, promote them. And last but not least, you need a measurement framework and technology platform that allow fast iteration, testing, and measurement. Are you interested to hear more? Then check out our conversation with Martin Danoes-Astro, who gives further insights and real-life examples on how to change a company's operating model. But before that, let me quickly recap what we've discussed in this video. Agile at Scale is a way to balance alignment and autonomy for digital-ready organizations by establishing new ways of working. It relies on autonomous, multidisciplinary squads that drive end-to-end delivery of a product or a service in an iterative fashion. Agile increases time to market, productivity, and employee engagement. And last but not least, implementing Agile at Scale is a multi-year journey that requires a complete transformation of a company's operating model.
Hi, we have talked about Agile, we have talked about new ways of working, and today I'm happy to have with us Martin Danoes-Astro. So Martin is a senior partner in our Amsterdam office. He is one of our global topic leaders for Agile at Scale in BCG, and I'm very happy to welcome you, Martin, to this discussion.
Thank you.
So Martin, we have talked about what Agile is, at least the theory part of it, but why is it important now to talk about Agile at Scale? What are the benefits that a company will perceive in today's world compared to, 10, 20 years ago?
All right, so this concept of Agile has been around for decades already. And as you probably know, it started in software engineering. And so therefore, originally, it was mostly confined to large tech companies and startups, really. But over the past 5 years or so, we see Agile ways of working making their way to more traditional companies as well. And the reason for that ultimately is the fact that the world around us is changing so rapidly, and a lot of that change is driven by technology. So when we discuss Agile with our clients, it very often comes down to the following. They want to become better and faster in responding to changing customer requirements. They want to increase effectiveness and efficiency by breaking down internal silos and taking out bureaucracy. And they want to increase employee engagement to be able to attract and to retain the talent that they need in a digital world. So Agile really is not a goal in itself, it is a means to an end.
And when you want to implement Agile at scale, especially if you are a legacy company, what are the trade-offs you need to think of? What are the ways you should be thinking of implementing it in the long run?
Yeah, so, to a large extent, it depends on the starting position and on in how far the top leadership team is already convinced and committed of the need to change. And so broadly speaking, we would see two different approaches that companies take to implementing Agile at scale. Sometimes you have a top team, a CEO and a top team that is completely convinced that continuing the way we used to do things is not going to be good enough, and we actually have to change our culture, our way of working, to be able to survive in our industry. And in those instances, it's very often a top-down, CEO-led transformation, with all the characteristics of a traditional transformation, but doing it in an agile way. So you need full leadership team commitment, they need to be willing to embrace change, and they need to drive the change as the leaders of the organization. In other instances, we see companies that say, well, we realize that we have to change our way of working, but we're not completely convinced yet of Agile. And so what they often do is they would start with pilots and they would build a few first lighthouse projects in Agile. They will see that this works well, and they might scale that up to the level of an Agile portfolio. So think about, for example, doing all your digital work in an Agile portfolio. And then when this is working well, you add more portfolios. Of course, at some stage, you will come to a tipping point where you would say, instead of trying to manage these Agile portfolios as an exception in our organization, by now we're actually, A, we're convinced, and B, we realize that things will even become easier if we would go beyond that tipping point and really change the organization into an Agile organization. So those would basically be the two approaches we see.
And wherever you embark, whether with the gradual or the more transformational approach, there is a need to change the whole operating model of a company. It's not about implementing one or two new processes or one or two coordination mechanisms. It's really changing the whole operating model. Can you walk us through the key building blocks when you want to achieve such an ambitious target?
Yes. So first of all, I think the three foundational elements of building an Agile organization are, first, the actual Agile and iterative way of working. And so in Agile, you have many ceremonies and artifacts. Think of breaking the work down into small chunks, which we call minimum viable products. The teams work in short sprints. They have daily stand-up meetings. They have retrospectives. And all of that is really geared towards the value that Agile brings by focusing the team on the value delivery, by focusing the team on delivering value for customers, by increasing transparency, and by increasing adaptability. So that's the actual Agile way of working. But to build an Agile organization, there's two other elements that you need to get in place. First of all, in Agile, the teams work in small, multidisciplinary, persistent teams. Think of these teams like mini startups. And so having a mini startup and an iterative way of working is actually relatively easy for one team. But the real challenge comes when you try to scale this across hundreds of teams and thousands of people. And that is where the real challenges of scaling come in. And to do that properly, you actually have to adapt all elements of the operating model. And it starts with leadership, right? So if you want to be able to have empowered and autonomous teams, you can only do that if you have super strong alignment as well. So leaders need to focus on overall company purpose, overall company strategy, and the overall company priorities, and then be able to let the teams figure out how to do things. So it starts with leadership behavior as a change. But at the same time, you will have to address things like governance and funding, because in the old world, you would be allocating, let's say, funding to projects, right? So you would have a discussion on change budgets. In the new world, you would be allocating capacity, Agile squads or Agile teams, to business outcomes. So it's a whole different way of thinking about funding. You would have to rethink the structures and the roles in the organization, because you actually move away from functional silos to small multidisciplinary teams. The role of managers might change. But in essence, you actually have to change almost all elements of the HR models around it. So the way you do recruiting, the way you do performance management, the way you thinking about new career paths for experts in the organization. And as the essence of Agile is trying to put the multidisciplinary teams together, ideally they are co-located. So that means rethinking the location strategies. If you have people, part of the organization is very often outsourced or even offshore, so it also requires rethinking some of the sourcing strategies. And whenever Agile is applied in a software environment, you also have to think about the underlying IT enablers. So think about modular IT architecture using APIs, or think about automating the IT processes, continuous delivery, automated testing. And so all of that would actually have to go in parallel to changing the organization into an Agile way of working as well. And lastly, Agile organizations are very data-driven, so you also have to make sure that you have the data, metrics, and tools in place to actually be able to do that. So with that, I really think implementing Agile at scale does require to address all elements of that operating model.
So Martin, those are a lot of components to get right to scale up Agile. Do you have an example of a company that did it successfully in the last few years?
Yeah, so interestingly, I think the industry that we saw going into adapting Agile ways of working first, after the large tech companies and the startups, was banking. And we have banks, particularly first in the Netherlands, but also in Australia and in the US, we see banks taking on Agile ways of working. And one of the reasons for this might be that banking is, to a large extent, becoming a technology industry. And banks feel the heat of these fintechs all around them. So they were one of the first who really felt the pressure. And on top of that, banks happen to be probably one of the more traditional and siloed organizations we had. So to them, taking out bureaucracy and breaking down silos was absolute must to be able to survive in banking. Now, more recently, we see Agile also making its way beyond banking to many other industries. So these days, we work with companies in consumer goods, in telcos, in insurance, in public sector, in industrial goods, and they're all adapting these Agile ways of working.
Great. Thanks a lot, Martin, for all that insight. And great to have you with us in the course.
Thank you. My pleasure.
In this video, I want to talk about data and analytics. Yes, data again. You have probably heard the expression, data is the new oil. Well, the analogy has its limitations, but it strikes a point. Whatever digital product or service you are building today, it is ultimately relying on data. In Module 3, we have defined big data and discussed the areas of applications it has, and even some of its challenges. In this video, I want to focus on how a company can actually use the data to create value. What capabilities does it need? What technology? Where should it start? And this is often the hardest part. Last year, I was discussing with the head of a customer analytics department. She was very excited that they were investing in a huge, brand new data and analytics infrastructure. The first question that I had was, what would you do in the first couple of months with this infrastructure to have a full payback on your investment? From what I have seen, it is not the technology infrastructure that makes or breaks data and analytics capabilities. Yes, a company needs technology and needs know-how to collect, store, and analyze data, but this can be scaled up gradually or even be outsourced relatively easily. The key is to start with a clear business objective, a clear vision of what the company wants to achieve. This is actually the first of 4 domains you need to think about when building data and analytics capabilities. The second one is data usage. How is the ambition translated into tangible use cases? The next domain to tackle is data engine. What capabilities does a company need in order to implement those use cases? And last but not least, a company needs to take into account its full data ecosystem. Who beyond the company itself can support the development of those capabilities?